Jesus was crucified, quite possibly in the April of 33 AD. Having been born in about 6 BC, he was about 38 or 39 years old. He was crucified at about 9 AM and died at about 3 PM. That one man changed everything. What was it like? It can be hard for us to imagine it. We don't live in that kind of culture. Our religious life, our life of faith, is not part of public life now like it was then. Describing it can be tricky. And as the author L.P. Hartley said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So I want to try to give a different point of view. Imagine that you live in a pleasant, unassuming house, partway between the middle of whatever town or village you live near, and some out-of-town place where people sometimes gather. And you're sat quietly in your living room or your front room. You're enjoying a cup of something nice. It's a lovely day, and you're enjoying the sunshine streaming through the window. You've turned off the radio and the television to enjoy the peace and quiet. And then in the background and getting louder, you hear something like cheering. It's coming from the direction of where the people live. But you're quite comfortable in your chair, so you stay put. After all, the drink is just about right, and you've got a piece of cake. But the noise keeps getting louder, and then you notice it's less of a cheer and more of a roar. Is it a bunch of bikers coming through? Is it maybe a couple of big lorries? Is it a protest about the new houses that are going up or something like that? No, because you probably would have heard about those things. So what's all the fuss for? And eventually you realise it is people, but they're not cheering, they're shouting. So you find your old slippers, the ones you keep by the door for when you take out the recycling, and you walk out into your front garden. And just as you open the door, the crowd starts pouring past. They're not moving quickly, but there are a lot of people out there. You see a friend in the crowd and call out, "Hey, what's going on?" It's that man, the one who's been on the news so much this week. He was filmed going into court, remember? He's that terrorist who threatened to blow up St. Paul's Cathedral and overthrow the government. Those guys he was radicalising, they call him Jesus. So what? You shout back. So they're going to hang him out to dry today, literally. Before you can ask any more questions, your friend has been carried along by the crowd. And in that moment you see the face of the man he was talking about. It's a face you've seen before, in newspapers and on television. And just for a second, he looks straight at you. And he looks terrible. Someone has clearly smacked him round the face a few times. There's cuts around his eyes and bruises on his cheeks. He's got a split lip and a nasty looking graze just by his hairline. One of his ears looks pretty mangled up too. He's wearing a plain t-shirt that's grubby and in tatters. It's almost falling off him completely. His trousers are dirty and ripped and he's got nothing on his feet. Just in that one glance there's something deeply upsetting. There is agony in his eyes. He looks as if he's been crying, but there are no tears now. And yet his face has a determined look. Just under the deafening noise of the angry crowd, there's another sound. It's the sound of metal dragging along the ground. This man, with his appalling appearance and broken expression, this man has a 10-foot long steel pole over his shoulder. It's like a giant L shape. One end is digging into his skin through the t-shirt. The other end is just scraping the tarmac every step he takes. By now he's beyond your front door. There are several armed police officers walking with the crowd. A few military personnel are there as well, but they don't seem to be doing anything. Fascinated and appalled, you grab your key, pull the door shut and step out into the crowd. You push forward to follow this man whose face so disturbed and moved you. He's using every shred of his remaining energy to pull this pole behind him, and every few feet he seems to stumble and stop, and each time a police officer jabs some kind of electric rod in his ribs, and then suddenly this man just collapses. One of the police grabs a guy out of the crowd. He looks like a foreigner, maybe even an immigrant. They shove the metal pole on his shoulder. Then another of the police grabs this Jesus character by his arm and pulls him up. He looks like he's going to collapse again straight away. Everyone is just yelling at him. They're shouting, "Terrorist!" and "Hater!" One man calls out, "Go back to where you came from, faker!" Someone spits at him. Someone else throws something at him that really doesn't smell good. Before you know it, the crowd is arriving at this out-of-town place. There are some racing ahead and others holding back, still shouting and jeering. A police officer and one of the men in military uniform produce a rope. They tie one end around the man's wrists. The other end is tied to one end of the pole, the crosspiece of the L. The police and army people work together to pull the steel pole upright. This Jesus is still tied to it. They drop it into a hole in the ground, and those close by feel a jolt under their feet. This man, this accused terrorist, this broken human, his whole body goes limp as he's lifted off the ground. He can't hold his own body weight. A small group of women and a young man are off to one side. They're not jeering. They are crying. And you can only imagine that they know him. And this man that his own people called Jesus, he's struggling to breathe under the weight of his own body. And all of a sudden, none of the accusations and insults matter to you. You stay and you watch, transfixed. After hours of struggle, blood oozing from under his t-shirt, breath rattling, after hours of the angry crowd looking on with contempt and hatred, and all the time with the police and the army stood at the base of the pole, he stops breathing. And it's clear that he's died. But one of the army guys just makes sure anyway. And it's over. You go home. Your drink is cold. Your cake is dry. Your day has disappeared. And you feel heartbroken. But you can't quite work out why. Why should it matter to you? It's not like you knew him. The real Jesus died in agony, possibly in the April of AD 33, 1987 years ago and about a week. He was put on a cross at about 9 a.m. and died at about 3 p.m. He was 38 or 39 years old. But he was not a terrorist. People were afraid of him, but he was not violent. His death took place with his knowledge. He did nothing to stop the torture. He chose not to intervene despite the agony. Knowing he would suffer mental and emotional torment, he still let it all happen. The shame he went through, the betrayal he suffered, the loneliness he experienced, the injustice he was subjected to, the bleeding. All of this was for you and for me. And it wasn't about getting our attention. It wasn't about making us feel guilty. It wasn't done to leave us with a burden of obligation. It was done simply because he wanted to win you back.